My name is Carol McCoy. Today is December the 5th, 2022, at the Nashville Bar Association offices, 150 4th Avenue, Suite 1350 in Nashville, Tennessee. This interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. Hello.
Good afternoon, Carol.
Would you please state your full name, where you were born, and the date that you were born?
All right, I'm Claudia Bonnyman. I was born in Morristown, Tennessee, which you know is in the eastern part of the state, in 1948.
Would you tell us about your family? And in this instance, I want you to expand a little bit beyond your parents and your grandparents because of the history that's related to your relatives.
One of the lawyers in my past, at least one. There were about 15,000 people who lived in Morristown, Tennessee when I grew up there. We were free-range children. There were 4 of us. We had wonderful parents, especially for little children, because my father loved to play. And we'd be out in the backyard and all the neighbors would be there. We'd play croquet or badminton or kickball. And our backyard was the center of the neighborhood because my father played with us every game and had more fun than we did. He was a lawyer. His father
name?
was a lawyer, Paul Capps. I think he was born in 1922. He, as I said, he was a lawyer. He was a graduate of Cumberland Law School. And his father was a lawyer who also attended Cumberland. And his grandfather, who became a governor of Tennessee, was also a lawyer and a chancellor in, I believe, would have been Overton County. Our favorite companion was a horse that our parents bought for us with the idea that if we learned how to ride horses, it would build our confidence. And it really did. The only time that I sneaked out of the house late at night, and you had to creep down these. My bedroom was upstairs, so it was an old house. So it took me about a half hour to get from my bedroom out the front door because I had to move very, very quietly and slowly and make sure they couldn't hear me. But the only time I sneaked out was when I was a young teenager and I snuck out to go ride my horse with the other kids at the barn that was a bicycle right away. I think my parents would have been horrified, but it was also a confidence builder.
Tell me, before we get too much into your childhood, you named your father Paul Capps. He was born in Donaldson.
He was.
And your mother, what was her name?
Marie.
And she was born
In Fayetteville.
And their mother and father, who were they?
My father's parents also lived in Donaldson, and they stayed in Donaldson. And her name was Sarah Dean, and he was Paul. As I said, he was also a lawyer. Sarah Dean really exemplified a very capable woman who was primarily looking after her home. But she became the president of anything she touched, and she taught tailoring at Watson School. So she did get outside of the home, and she was very dignified and smart.
And her maiden name was Roberts.
Her name, that's right.
And your father's name was Capps. So your maiden name was Capps.
That's right.
And why is the name Roberts important in your genealogy?
Well, A.H. Roberts went from Chancery Court to the position of governor, which is very, very unusual. But as he began to run for his second term, at that time, governors served for 2 years. So they kind of had to start campaigning as soon as they took office. But he was important to the state because he had to make a decision about whether to call a special session to consider whether the state of Tennessee would vote to ratify the 19th Amendment. And there was only one state left that was needed to push the 19th Amendment through, and Tennessee, the spotlight was on Tennessee. And this governor had to decide whether to call the session at all, and then whether to call the session before the primary or after the primary. So he called it after he was reelected as the Democratic candidate. He called a special session. At that special session, he announced that he was 100% behind the women's vote, that he would do the best he could to convince the reluctant legislators to vote for it too. So it kind of looked as though he might be a little lukewarm at first, but he was not lukewarm as soon as he called a special session. He appeared before the special session, advocated for the women's vote, and then did all he could to get legislators to vote. And we know it was a really close call, but it did pass, and that's why we're here today.
That's historical.
Mhm.
Before we move on, was your father involved in any businesses or other activities other than practicing law?
He was very active in the First Methodist Church. He was the trustee. He was the head of various offices that had to be held in the United Methodist Church. And he wasn't there every time the doors opened. He was very faithful. And he was a faithful Methodist, just all around, a really good model.
And your mother?
And my mother was very serious about homemaking. She did a little bit of volunteer work, but basically she focused on her 4 children.
Did your father have any political or community activities that you recall?
He, Morristown College, when I was growing up, was a college established to educate African Americans. And he was involved in its ongoing health, its financial health, and its expansion. And it ultimately closed, but not on his watch.
He get involved with the housing.
He was the attorney for the local housing agency. So he had always had a lot of stories about the changes that were going on in the town, about housing that was needed, about housing that wasn't there, about and of course the people in the separate housing situations were not his clients. It was the agency that was his client. But he was pretty devoted to the idea of making better housing situation for everybody.
And I think you mentioned that as a lawyer, he emphasized confidentiality.
He did. There were two things that he spoke about a lot. One was that the judicial branch could not be effective unless everybody was truthful and had a high value for truth. And the other thing he said was, if someone honors you with a confidence, you have to keep it. There's some very rare circumstances that are exceptional, but in the main, you have to keep those confidences, and those were good lessons.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
2 sisters and a brother. My younger brother is still in Morristown practicing law in my father's old firm.
And his name is?
His name is Christopher Paul
Caps.
Caps.
And your older sister?
And my older sister married a high school sweetheart, actually a junior high sweetheart. And she's living in Knoxville and Grandfather Mountain. Her name is Diane.
And what is the name of your other sister?
And my other sister, Paula, just retired as a physical therapist.
Paula Kaiser, I think.
Paula Kaiser.
Now, as far as, I think you said a little bit about your community and how you were free range children. Besides riding your horse, did you have any other recreational interests?
Oh my goodness, of course, I was a cheerleader. And at that time, the basketball team consisted of the county girls primarily girls from the rural areas. They were really good and they were really tall. And nobody ever mentioned to me playing basketball or really any other sport. They just weren't. I could play croquet great, badminton and croquet, but those were not competitive sports as far as the school was concerned. But I was in the band and I played the French horn, seated next to Gary Blackburn, also a well-known attorney in Nashville.
when you were in between summers, did you have any hobbies or fun things that you like to do, either around the house or in the yard or?
Oh, I love to read. And my mother loved to have our help with the household chores, which as an adult, I totally get that. But my main goal for almost each day, besides swimming, was to find a place, usually with one particular tree, where I could go read and my mother could not find me. So and we lived in a neighborhood with lots of kids. So we had tons and tons of neighborhood friends, and we were playing everything you could think of.
You had mentioned that while your father wasn't a farmer, that you did ride in trucks and visited your friends on farms, and you ended up.
It was a farming community, so it was hard to find a friend who didn't live on a farm. And that's where I got invited, and that's where I went. And this was back when people piled their kids in the back of the truck and then just took off wherever they're going. It was very dangerous, but we loved it. We had a ball. Everybody had dogs. We had dogs too, but everybody had dogs. And farming and treasuring the land that was the culture.
Did you participate in any of the farming, the tobacco or anything at all?
I did help pick tobacco one time, and it's very hard work. It's very sticky, difficult work. But at least I can say I know something about it, but really very little. But everybody grew tobacco when I was growing up.
Where did you go to elementary school?
A little school called Hillcrest.
Do you recall any of your favorite teachers?
I'm going to say my favorite teacher across elementary school, junior high, and high school was a science teacher named Gene Smith. And the reason he was a favorite was he treated each and every one of his students, whether they were boys or girls, that they would probably be scientists. And he really invested in us. I had lovely teachers in elementary school, but he had a tremendous impact on me because when I left the 8th grade, which he taught, I was going to be a marine biologist.
And
I did not do that, but obviously
it was initial
he
interest.
was a great teacher.
Where did you go to junior high?
There was just one junior high. That's not correct. The Black children had a junior high, and we had a junior high. It was a very segregated community. It wasn't until I was a junior in high school that the first African-American student enrolled.
Where did you go to high school?
Morristown High School. There was one white high school and one black high school.
You mentioned Gary Blackburn. I didn't want to rush you into that, but did you have any favorite classes in high school?
I like the science classes, and I love the English classes that required a lot of writing.
Had you at some time developed an interest in reading nonfiction? You initially told me that you really liked fiction, Little Women.
I didn't really appreciate nonfiction until I was probably in my 40s. Of course, I read nonfiction for work, but for pleasure, not real often.
Now, Gary Blackburn is an attorney here in Nashville. Were there any other friends that you had who became lawyers too?
Malcolm McCune was my next door neighbor.
And he's a lawyer in Nashville.
I think he's retired, but he was a very good lawyer in Nashville.
What, besides band, what other activities did you participate in?
I was in the Brownies and the Girl Scouts. I was an officer and was active in our Methodist Youth Fellowship. And I didn't do 4-H because I didn't have any animals. So, but I saw a lot of 4-H activity. That was a lot of fun.
What memorable trips did you take in either junior high or high school?
My parents primarily focused on the Smoky Mountains National Park. So that's where we spent a lot of our vacations. It's where we spent a Saturday. We could drive over Saturday morning and walk the creeks. We love to walk the creeks in the Smoky Mountains.
8th grade, did you make a trip to the White House?
8th grade, our class went to Washington DC. That was a huge excursion. I had no idea the world was so big.
As you got to the end of high school, had you had summer jobs at all during high school?
Occasionally, I worked in my father's office if he needed some clerical assistance, or if he wanted me to have a job. But generally speaking, in Morristown, middle-class girls did not have jobs. Middle-class girls didn't work. The boys worked, but I can't think of a single girl who worked during the summers. I'm sure there were some. It just wasn't that common, and that's unfortunate.
As you got closer to graduating from high school, what steps did you take with regards to college? How did you choose it?
We at Morristown High School really did not have a college counselor. And even though my father was a lawyer, he was not a college graduate.
You told me this earlier, that neither of your parents
Yeah,
were college graduates.
That's right.
How did he get to be a lawyer?
Well, at the time that he attended law school, I don't know what year that would have been. Think about that. You did not have to have any college. And you go to law school, you would take the exam. You didn't have to be an apprentice either. So in a way, it would have been better for him if he had had a college education, because he really loved to learn. But he had children, he had to figure out a way to make a living, and so that was the road that he took. So he was a fine lawyer.
So when you came to the decision of going to college, how did that go?
I helped myself, and I started at a women's college in Georgia because my mother had attended that college. She'd been very happy there. I stayed there for 1 year. I made wonderful friends. They were all those students were women. A lot of them were very, very smart, very capable. But the level of instruction was not very satisfying. And so I transferred to University of Tennessee, where the array of subjects and difficulty was pretty broad.
And your major?
My major was English and anthropology.
Did you have any jobs outside of working for your father during college?
During college, I had a couple of clerical type jobs in the summer, for, a number of weeks at a time, because I was also taking courses so I could try to finish early.
I think that you told me during college, you took a trip to Europe.
I did.
How did that come about?
University of Tennessee Singers was advertising for singers to come and audition to sing before the ambassador of Denmark, who was from Middle Tennessee. And we'd been invited, UT singers had been invited to come and perform for him and for his staff and guests. So that was really the goal of the trip. But I did audition. And another person who auditioned and went on the trip was my spouse's sister, Anne, and that is how I met my wonderful spouse, Gordon. And so it was a fabulous outcome.
She introduced you to Gordon.
She did.
And what year in college was this that you went to?
This was after my junior year, we went to Europe with the University of Tennessee Singers, where we were invited to go like 2 places, and we had a choreography and we had all these dances and songs. So if we ended up in a restaurant, which we often did, we would just get up and do our shtick right there, whether anybody wanted us to or not. And this happened a lot. It was so much fun. We talk about free range kids in Europe. We had a fabulous time, and the music was pretty good. I mean, I learned a lot. Some of these people were very serious musicians.
So when you returned, you started your senior year.
Started the senior year.
And how was it that you met Gordon?
Well, when we came back from our trip with the UT Singers, where I roomed with Anne Bonnyman, she invited me to come visit in Knoxville at her home. he was in Marshtown, 50 miles away, so I came to visit for a weekend and met Gordon and his whole family. And I have to say, I was smitten immediately because I just never met anybody like Gordon.
I think you said that it didn't take long after you met him, make it a permanent association. Is that right?
That's right.
How long?
Well, he called me about a week after we met at his home and asked me to go somewhere, and I told him I already had plans, which was true. And then I had the brilliant idea to say, would you ask me again? And he said, what about next weekend, next Saturday? And I said, I don't have conflict. I'll be there. Where are we going? So I was talking with my spouse about this the other day, and I said, that date was a very brave date on your part because he invited me to spend the day. We went to, we just traveled across Tennessee in his old car, talking and stopped and saw things and, came back home, and I didn't sleep all night because I thought, oh my gosh. This is it.
So how long was it before you all graduated and were married?
Well, he had already graduated. He was in law school at UT. And I was finishing up, and we married in April of my senior year. So that was about 6 months.
Are there any other activities in college that you recall that were meaningful to you, or any friends that you haven't mentioned that you met?
I'm trying to think of people who ended up in Nashville or other lawyers.
I think you mentioned that you were in a sorority, and that was
Chi Omega.
an Angel Flight, which was
You were able, do I really have to tell you about all this?
no,
Because Angel Flight was a sister organization to the ROTC.
And you also met Linda Ashford
Yes, Linda Ashford was also an Angel Flight person.
and Barry Blackburn was at UT.
He was at UT. He was
You
very active in college politics, very effective.
Now, he was a little older than you.
1 year.
Oh, okay. And as a result of knowing Linda, I think you had mentioned that Gordon was good friends with,
Tom Grooms.
and who was Tom Williams?
And
He's a
Tom-
lawyer here in
Tom
town.
Grooms is a lawyer here. He worked for the Department of Labor for many years in their black lung program. And, yeah, they were great companions, wonderful companions.
It was through you and Gordon that Linda and Tom met. Is that correct?
No,
No, they
no,
already knew
they
each other.
already knew each other.
Okay.
They had barely met as well.
So after you graduated from college, what did you do?
I looked for a teaching job. And there were none. It was a really bad time for teachers. I can't remember something about the economy. I can't remember what the specific problems were. This would have been in 1970 and 71. And Gordon and I took the back road one day to visit with my parents, and we drove past Kingswood School, which was a home for children. It was I would say, fundamentalist Christian school for children who did not have a home, either because both parents were gone or one parent was gone. And so we stopped, drove up the driveway, and went in to see the principal. And he said, when I told him that I was coming to apply for a position as teacher, he said, the Lord has sent you. And I was a little surprised, but that was sort of the atmosphere. And the children were wonderful. It was a great experience for me. And I saw that I did not have the spark that I always appreciated in my special teachers. I just didn't have that spark for teaching, and I was going to have to figure out something else. If I hadn't concluded that law school was my best bet, I'm sure I would have thought continue to teach.
How did you start to think about law school? What kind of triggered it for you thinking about going to law school?
Well, my spouse was a lawyer, was in law school and very engaged in the clinic activities there, which were provided legal services to indigent people. So I kept hearing all those stories. And of course, my father was a lawyer. All of that was kind of back there brewing. And then a young woman friend came by our apartment one day who was, I knew her. She was from Knoxville and, we had a lot in common. And she asked me to sign some sort of political petition. But in the meantime, told me that she'd just taken the LSAT and that she intended to go to law school. So she turned around and left after we talked for a little while. And then I thought, well, if she can do that, why can't I do that? I didn't know women were doing this. So I took the LSAT and attended University of Tennessee the first year. My spouse was there too. I can't remember how in the world we fed ourselves, but we did. We just had little jobs. And University of Tennessee tuition was something like $250 a quarter. So that was something we could do. And we lived a very Spartan life about which we were quite happy.
You were first year law school and
Gordon was second.
And
Let me think about that. He was third year.
third year.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Mhm.
So when Gordon finished law school, what were your plans at that point?
Well, our plans were to go someplace like Alaska, specifically Alaska, because we wanted an adventure. And so Gordon applied. Gordon specifically had limited his interest to legal services programs. So he rode across the country and got back rejection letters. They weren't even rejection letters. They were just letters saying, we have no openings, we have no money, we have no openings. And meanwhile, he was trying to get employed by legal services here in Nashville, but they had no money and they had no openings. Well, I'm sorry, he wasn't doing that. He probably included Nashville in his search, but I don't remember that. We made the decision that we needed to leave Knoxville so that we could become more adult-like, since both our sets of parents lived very close to us. And we got along great with our parents, but we really felt like we needed to grow up some. So we decided on Nashville. And I was admitted as a transfer student at Vanderbilt Law School. And Gordon basically followed me because he didn't have a job. So he has some interesting stories about his looking for a job, because at that time, UT students were second-class citizens and Vanderbilt students really got most of the jobs. There weren't that many jobs at that time. There are now, but there weren't then. So he had his own adventures.
And you started at Vanderbilt when there were how many women?
There were 12 women at Vanderbilt. There had been 6 at University of Tennessee Law School. So I felt I had doubled my chances of having good friends and good advice, and it just seemed like a better place in that way.
I think that you had Sissy Daughtry as an instructor.
She was a professor.
And taught you.
And she taught evidence and I think she might have taught civil procedure at some point. She also taught the women to have ambitions, to not give up, and she would help whoever needed help. She would help them. She came up to me and, well, let me just say this. The first woman law student I met was Carol McCoy, was you, Carol. And everybody knows how friendly Carol is, and she was very friendly to me. I was a transfer student, so I didn't really have a class that I was close to. So when Carol said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. We've got other women here, and I think you're going to like it," and so on, I felt like she was inviting me to a friendship that made me very happy. So the second woman who came up to me and was friendly was Professor Daughtry. And she just had a very different approach in that I mean, she made an effort to get to know people individually. I'm not saying that the other faculty members, all of whom were male, didn't do that, but I just didn't have that experience with it. Remember, I was a transfer student, so that would make a difference. But Sissy Daughtry was welcoming. She confided she confided sort of her career issues and let us know that we were going to hit some bumps, but that we could do it. And then she was also very good at her craft. She was just a very good teacher. She worked really, really hard to get there.
Did you find that there were other professors at the law school that were more welcoming than others and that you enjoyed?
Well, Tom Sherrard was a very young professor who taught UCC. He also did a great job. And maybe you can help me here, Paul.
Sanders.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, labor law. One of the,
Harold Levinson.
I had Harold Levinson for administrative law. You know, everybody they were all really accessible, open-minded people.
I think you had a very remarkable professor in Bill Harbison.
Bill Harbison was adjunct, so he taught civil procedure. And at the end, everybody was crazy about him, but me included. So almost at the end of the course, I asked him if I could clerk for him because he had just been appointed to the Supreme Court. And he looked at me and he said, nobody else has asked me. Yes, you can. And I thought, oh, thank goodness, I got here first. And so that was my first job, working for Justice Bill Harbison.
What an exciting experience. What was it like?
Well, I was a law clerk. He did not need a law clerk.
And why was that?
Because there wasn't anything he didn't know, but he did teach me a lot of things. But one of the things that I remember so clearly was whatever you're researching, go first to what he called the green books, the Tennessee Code, because your subject matter may well be covered there, at least addressed there. You want to start with either the encyclopedias or the green books. So that's what I've always done. At that time, the 5 Supreme Court justices allowed the law clerks to attend their meetings at which they assigned opinions to be written, and also when they made the decision about the opinion.
Discussion that they.
Yes. And of course, at that time, I thought, well, that's what everybody gets to do with working for judges, but that is really not accurate because law clerks are not generally allowed at all to be a part of them. We were not part of the discussion, but we were allowed to sit there and listen.
And I think you said later they eliminated that.
They did eliminate it, which I thought was unfortunate, but I could see why they did it. Some sort of information got out that was confidential and no one knew. I mean, makes me think of our current U.S. Supreme Court's problem. I think cutting back on the numbers of people who have access to those decisions before the opinions were issued was probably a good idea. I don't know what else they could have done.
Before you started working for Justice Harbison, you had to take the bar exam.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And did you find that difficult? How did you prepare for it? And what were the results?
Yeah, I thought it was difficult. The thing that was so hard about it was that so much was writing on passage of the bar exam. And, just like anybody else, I felt pretty anxious about it. I think the anxiety was really the hardest part, but I just studied all the time. I think that I did not work for like 2 months before I took the bar exam.
You were taking the prep course
I took
by
a
yourself.
I did.
No study group, right?
No study group, no.
Then after you finished the exam, I think you said you and Gordon went on a trip.
We went on a vacation. And it's the only unsuccessful, I would say only vacation we ever went on that wasn't really a big success for both of us. And that was because I was sort of dead to myself. I mean, I was just a blank slate. I didn't feel like I had passed, and I was exhausted and just, I mean, I can remember that trip really well, and I did bring back a lot
And
with
where did
me.
you go?
We went to New England. We just traveled around New England.
I think you said that was in July and that it was at the time when
It was
the
very crowded.
president was under law. This is.
I remember President Nixon's speech when he resigned, or not when he resigned, but when he addressed the population in this country to say goodbye, basically. And we saw that on television, and that was, that was really sad, really sad. So it wasn't a great time after that exam, but I did pass, and most people did.
And you went to work for Justice.
I went to work for Justice Harvey.
And I asked you, but I don't know that you recalled what your first salary was,
I don't recall.
right? Well, that can happen. How long do you think you worked for Justice Harvey?
Well, I was there for about 8 months when Tom Shriver called me to say he had an opening in his office. It was that I would be prosecuting some criminal cases, but also managing all the child support collection.
Harvey said to you at that time.
He said, I think you've gotten a tremendous amount out of this job and probably all you're going to get. I didn't know exactly what that meant. But he said, I think you should take this opportunity because it might not arise again for a while. And you've got to be ready when something like that comes along. And I was very fortunate to get to work in Tom Shriver's office, and it was just a great education.
And at the time, do you recall who your colleagues were? How many other women there were?
There were no other women who were lawyers. A lot of the staff were, but there were no other lawyers. And Ed Yarborough was there. Carol McCoy, both really good lawyers. Sterling Gray. And Tom Thurman was there. That's right.
And Roger
He
Fish.
just retired. Roger Fish.
Judy Manning.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Carol. This is from my notes, your notes.
Well, it's good for me to know that you had a lot of friends there, including another woman who came in as a lawyer.
And that was Mary Rubin, who actually, I was given the authority to find someone to help with the child support, because I was going to move on to do primarily criminal prosecution. So I felt like I had sort of graduated, although I also was aware of how important collecting child support is for the community and for all women. So, so I found, I think, Mary Rubin, who made that office and that work her career. And she didn't stay in child support because nobody stays in one position for years in that office. Everybody moves around somewhat. So she moved to another department in the same office and made her career there.
And you moved up to jury cases.
Actually, I tried several jury cases with Jude Linehan, with Hal McDonough, probably somebody else who I can't think of that right now. But I was never assigned to the sixth floor where the jury trials took place. I did most of my work in General Sessions Court. And when I asked to be moved to the sixth floor, it was explained to me at that time that the judges would not be accepting a woman. And that was, it was not done or said in a mean way, in a
Just matter of fact.
just sort of like, this is just the way it is, and there's really nothing I can do about it. And
How
You
did
know.
that strike?
Well, I was surprised. I was surprised. But I also thought, there aren't any women up there. Sissy Daughtry had been assigned on the 6th floor, and she'd done as far as I knew, as far as I know today, did an excellent job. But for whatever reason, the problem with, unfairness is that a person who is affected by the unfairness, you never have enough information to really be able to evaluate the situation. But I stayed on in that office, and was really pretty happy. I mean, I would love to have been promoted, but I was pretty happy with my colleagues and with the work that I got to do, and doing some jury trials every once in a while was pretty rewarding. So I got to continue to do those.
You mentioned a case that you were involved in that had a lot of exhibits. It was a burglary case. It sounded rather entertaining.
It was entertaining, but I remember it because it was so difficult getting all the exhibits labeled and getting them before the jury.
What kind of exhibits were there?
The people who had done the burglary, who were accused of doing the burglary, the defendants, had done everything they could to disguise themselves before they broke into the home and while they broke into the home and when they left the home. For instance, just for one example, they wore boots that were larger than their foot size. And so the boots were exhibited. And that's just an example. You know, they wore gloves that were a lot bigger than their hands were. So that was a pretty good disguise, but I think, as I remember, I think they were caught with the goods that had been stolen and with the gloves and with the boots. So some smart person put all that together and went and looked at the footprints. It was a really muddy, rainy night. So the footprints were important as evidence. Anyway, it was very funny. And they were kind of funny. The defendants were kind of funny.
And were they?
It was not a funny story because they did get convicted. But it was, I think the jury was entertained. I also think, like all juries I've ever had experience with, they took it very seriously.
You were with the DA from 1975 to 1978?
Or 1974 to 1978.
Oh,
And then, now let me think. I was there for 2 years and then I went to practice with Larry Woods and his firm. And my dear friend, Jinx Thomas, who was a classmate, and she was a year behind me, but she was working there. And so we thought that would be a good combination. It was really, really, really hard work for somebody just fresh out of the DA's office with no civil experience.
and is that the switch that you made from criminal to civil?
Right.
At the Woods firm?
I did. We did.
And how long did you stay there?
I was there 2 years.
And what caused you to leave?
I was almost 30. I was 29 and Gordon was maybe just barely 30. Maybe he'd been 30 for 2 months. And we had been talking our whole marriage. We've been married about 9 years by then. Talking our whole marriage about living in another country before we turned 30. We wanted to do that before we turned 30. So of course there was no internet at that time that we had access to. And so we had to write letters, we made calls, I don't know how we did it, but the Presbyterian Church of the USA hired us to work at their legal services office in West Bank, where the legal services program helped individual Palestinians with some legal problems, very limited, but some legal problems, but primarily focused on the settlements and on land issues, land grab issues, purchase of Israelis, Jewish Israelis of Arab land. And there were very serious legal issues involved with some of those purchases, not all, but some. And so that's what Quaker Service did.
And that's what you were going to do.
That's what I was going to do.
Now, I want to just make a little hiccup change here and say, you've been married about 9 years. Had you any children?
No,
And why was that? Had you discussed not having them for a while?
no. Oh, well, actually, well, let me think about that. We did discuss waiting because we thought we would be in a better situation all the way around if we didn't have children. And we were married at 21, and we're both 21 when we married. That's pretty young. And so we decided that we would be better parents, so we were older. So we just said, no children,
So
no children in the foreseeable future.
and as you're flying to Jordan, what happened?
Well, it's a funny way of putting it, but we landed in Jordan because that's the way the Quakers wanted us to come through customs to come into the country. And we came across the Allenby Bridge and then spent a couple of nights in Jordan. We got to Jerusalem, and as we drove to Jerusalem, I got really sick and Gordon got really sick. We both were, I think, responding to the food. And the Israeli physician, who was a primary care physician, came to us. In Israel, the doctor would come to you at your home, the way things used to be done in this country. So he came to our home and he looked at Gordon and he said, okay, I'm going to give you some Lamodal, I'm going to give you some tetracycline. And then he came to me and he said, could you be pregnant? And I said, no, I'm sure I'm not pregnant. And he said, I think you are. And I'm not going to give you tetracycline because it will make your baby's teeth discolored. So, and
you were
lo and
sick.
behold, I was pregnant and I stayed sick for like 2 months. And Gordon got hale and hearty immediately. So we had our child there we had our child in the US. We came back at the end of our service and had our son, Houston, who's now 43.
Well,
So
while you were there, I think you mentioned that there was a lawsuit before the Israeli Supreme Court. And what involvement did you all have in that?
there was an Arab lawyer who volunteered or who was asked to volunteer pro bono to represent a number of Palestinians in their effort, and he was Palestinian, in their effort to combat a certain way of purchasing land in the West Bank in particular, land that had been held in Arab homes and families for centuries. And that case went to the Israeli Supreme Court, which was, now I have a caveat here. I was so sick and nauseated that I did some administrative things in that office, but I did not help write the brief, but Gordon helped the Palestinian person write the brief, and I could kind of see his hand in it. The briefs were in English, and the court was conducted in English and some Hebrew, but mostly in English. So we could figure out what was going on, and all of the Israeli, that is Israeli Jewish Supreme Court justices were there sitting at the bench in their shirt sleeves, no robes, because it was really hot. So that's a desert, and that was the most obvious thing. And the other thing is that they, unlike the way our justices operated from the bench, their clerks would bring them books for them to dictate from and to read from. And so they were sort of being educated as they went. Now, I'm sure they did a lot of background reading, but Quaker Service and the plaintiffs did lose that case. And so the land boundary issues were resolved negatively to them, but there were other cases coming along.
When we spoke earlier, you mentioned about the way in which Middle Eastern people treat pregnant women and the contrast with the way that Americans treat not only pregnant women, but also small children.
children.
Can you remember those comments?
Well, I can. There were a lot of things, obviously, that were very different from living in Western countries and then living in the Middle East. But one thing that Gordon and I both noticed was that children of all ages were treated most respectfully and lovingly by their families and their extended families. It was noticeable. So that when we came back to the States and I started looking around, I thought, parents in the US can often speak sharply to their children and discipline them in a sharp way. We never saw that in Israel, but we also didn't see any children who needed any kind of severe, particular disciplining. While I was pregnant, and once I started showing, I think this happens in this country too, but more so in that country, people would come up to me and put their hands on my stomach and say, and bless me, and bless the male child that they knew I was carrying. It happened so often, you just had to laugh. You know, you just had to think, well, this is my destiny during this pregnancy. And I loved the positive attention. I mean, I just love that. We had a British educated Palestinian OBGYN. And I would go to his offices for a monthly checkup, and the office would be full of Bedouin women, black gloves, black socks, completely heads covered, just a little bit of eyes showing through. And I know there's a word for the clothing, but yeah. And so I would walk in and I would get called first, which was, you know, that did not make me feel very good, but I would go whenever they told me. And then the next thing I knew, all these Bedouin women had kind of piled into the office so they could see my examination and listen to my baby's heartbeat. That was kind of neat. Now, I had sisters, so it didn't bother me, you know, but I was sort of the show of the day. So I also want to say about our sojourn, it was a sabbatical in the West Bank in Jerusalem, that we arrived during the Camp David Accords, the peace accords, and there was a hope that there would be a two-state solution to the conflict between the Arabs and the Jewish Israelis. And so that all of that happened right when we landed. And so that there was a lot of hope. We did not see much violence at all while we were there. There was an explosion of a storefront window right after I had passed it. It had been in front of the window. I probably wouldn't have been hurt because it was kind of an implosion, but it was definitely a set bomb. And the other thing that happened while we were there was that the bus that went from the Mount of Olives, where we lived, down to the city through the West Bank to the old city, exploded. I mean, it also had been bombed, but there was nobody on the bus. So both of those explosions I know they did a lot of property damage, and that shouldn't be taken lightly, but that violence was relatively benign. Of course, there were people who were killed in violence too, but not while we were there.
And you had most of your pregnancy there.
Right.
Where was Houston born?
Houston was born in Nashville.
And when was he born?
1979 in May.
Okay, so
Now, I've just said that there wasn't much violence while we were there. I mean, there was tension. There was extreme segregation between the Arab neighborhoods, particularly Ramallah, which was a sort of political town, and the rest of Jerusalem. And most certainly Palestinians had to, of course, they had their own, not of course, but they had their own passport, and they were restricted in their travel. So, you know, this was obviously not a good thing, but I never read any newspaper articles. I think I read one newspaper article while I was there in which a woman who was a stranger, well, whether it's a stranger or not, a woman was assaulted. Now, women were often mistreated by their families. I mean, I say often, that's not very scientific, but women were mistreated by their families, they were kept in a strict behavioral mode. And if they stepped outside of that, like for instance, dated somebody who was from another faith, then the families would jump in and correct her. And so I'm not implying that women had easy lives there, but I'd never heard of a rape, never heard of a sexual assault while we were there. We arrived in the US, came back to our house on Blair Boulevard in Belmont Hillsborough neighborhood, which is a very safe neighborhood. And Gordon this is before Houston was born, but Gordon was awakened by somebody running down the alley right behind our house. And we turned on all the lights, and he did. And something just made him think something was off, something was wrong. And the next day we learned that a woman who lived right behind us had been raped. So the violence in the Middle East was one thing, and the violence in Nashville was something else. But they both had violent things to contend with.
When you returned to Nashville.
And I want to say just one more thing I want to say about being in Jerusalem. While we were there, the settlements near Jerusalem some settlements were being established and were expanding. After we left, settlements began cropping up everywhere. And the settlements, maybe more than anything else, doomed a two-state solution. Because the settlements were on Arab land. That's what they were on previously Arab land held by Arab people. So I say doomed, I mean, maybe there's a way around that. I don't know, but it certainly made things so much more difficult.
You still have that problem with the settlements and the land.
More and more. I mean, there are more and more settlements. So the problem gets worse and
And
worse.
you, I think, explained that the Israeli Jews had been fleeing Russia and other places where they had been tormented and were coming to Israel, this new country for them. And there is this conflict over land that seems to be never ending. When you returned to Nashville, what did you do?
When I came back to Nashville, and Houston was born, I decided, of course, I didn't have a job at that time. I need to start looking, and I did start looking. But at the same time, I was thinking, I'm only going to have, I mean, I knew that I wanted to work. I knew I did not want to stay home, even though I had this delightful baby. But I did decide that I would stay home for a year. And in that year, I would look for something that would start at the end of the year. And so I was able to do that. I was able to work for District Judge John Nixon. And so I clerked. I was back being a law clerk, and it felt pretty good.
And did you have a colleague clerk while you were there?
That was Karen Neal.
And
We had a wonderful time.
she is a lawyer here in town.
She is retired from Bass Berry.
That's another relationship that you had.
And I was going to say, before I became a law clerk for Judge Nixon, I worked part-time in a law firm with Keith Lundin, Jack Waddey, and the Hookers. Not John J. Hooker, but his brother, Henry Hooker. Thank you. So I worked part-time for them. They did not need a full-time attorney, but they did need a part-time attorney, and that was that was really a good experience.
And what was your experience in working for Judge Nixon like?
He had never had law clerks before, and we had never been, because he was a brand new judge. And so we were his first two law clerks. And so there was some kind of bumping around trying to figure out what we really could do well to help him. But I kind of think we figured it out. But I also think, and Karen stayed a second year.
Did you find that your prior experience as a law clerk was helpful?
I think my experience as a prosecutor and in private practice was very, very helpful. The law clerk experience was so different, the federal system, the state system, the personalities that I I wouldn't say there wasn't really a lot of commonality there.
Did you find that your work habits or your hours changed when you became a law clerk from what they had been when you were at the DA's office?
No, we had one reason I wanted that job was I knew it'd be interesting. I thought I could be helpful to the judge. And I knew that I would have a time in the evening when I knew that I could leave. And that is not the case with private practices, we know.
That's true.
So
After you clerked for Judge Nixon, where did you go?
I went back as a full-time attorney with what was then Jack Waddey and Lundin, Jack Waddey and Keith Lundin. There were other good lawyers there too.
Waddey and Jennings.
Well, Waddey and Jennings was later. It was Waddey, Lundin, and Newport, Bill Newport.
Bill.
I bet people remember Bill too. So Keith Lundin, Jack Waddey, and Bill Newport. And then Paul Jennings came later. And Dan Kaufman. He's a great lawyer.
And
Hank Hildebrand.
what was the nature of the work that you did there?
I represented a couple of real estate companies, real estate brokerage companies. You know, they've always got a lot of litigation going on. That was really fun. Well, it's a great learning experience, I'll put it that way. I had contract cases. I had cases in circuit court, in Chancery, and in general sessions. Didn't have any federal cases. So it was mostly state practice.
How long did you stay with Waddey and Newport?
It became Waddey and Jennings. So I was there for several years. And we then dissolved. And each person went their own way, or maybe had a fellow partner might have practiced law together. I think.
You went with the group at St. Cloud's Corner? Sure.
That was Waddey and Jennings.
Okay.
That was the Waddey, Lundin, Newport, and then Waddey and Jennings were there at St. Cloud Corner.
And the Mike Passano and Bob Delaney were there?
They were there in a separate outfit, I'm gonna say, separate firm. And I was there, I think another attorney with that group was, I can't remember who it was, but we all were practicing independently, but helping each other.
Right.
And Bob Delaney and Mike Passano were a wild bunch. Very, very capable, and they just took on really hard stuff, and they would just carry it through to the end.
And what was the next group that you joined?
I then, so after I'd been on my own for a while, I always knew that I wanted to be with a firm. I was only by myself as a temporary solution because I wanted to keep working. And so I then
Kelley?
went to Ortale, Kelley, where I became a partner. And whereas in my practice with Waddey and Jennings, you know, they really put that it was a new firm. Everybody had to pull their weight, pull on that oar really hard. So people stayed very late. Like people might get there, the guys, I would say in general, some of the guys would get there like at 8:30 or 9, and they might stay till 7, maybe even later working. And I couldn't do that because I didn't perceive that I could do that because I had a baby, a really young child. And I had a lot in common with my colleagues. I really liked my colleagues. They were all really good lawyers. Jack Waddey's still practicing, and so is Hank Hildebrand. I got to Ortale Kelley, and here's what would happen at Ortale Kelley. Bill Ortale, who had 6 kids, would come around to the office at about 6 o'clock every night, come himself, he'd stick his head in the door, or maybe he'd walk in, and he would say, "What are you doing? What are you doing here? It's 6 o'clock." And if you had a trial the next day, he would say, "Well, okay, you need any advice?" You know, but if you didn't have a trial, he would say, "It's time to go home. Your family's waiting on you." And he pretty much, if you wanted him to be happy with you, then you need to get out of there and go home, which I wanted to do anyway, but it was just different.
Focus of your practice shifted more from plaintiffs to insurance defense. Is that true?
Ortale Kelley represents State Farm, and then I picked up a couple of other, AIG became my client, and I started building my own client base, some of which I had maintained during the time I practiced by myself. Because when the firm dissolved, several of the lawyers went and did something else. Jack Waddey got into real estate for a while. I think he did very well, but he then came back to practice eventually. So because he wasn't practicing, and because I'd done some work with some of his clients, I just got clients from everybody because everybody was in a different configuration. And because the old, the partner that they used to go to wasn't there anymore, wasn't available anymore. So I picked up a lot of clients like that. And by the time I got to Ortale Kelley, I really had a pretty good inventory. So
How long did you stay at Ortale?
I stayed at Ortale Kelley until 1990, I think it was, when, you asked me when, 1990.
So about 10 to 12 years. And then about that time,
I didn't stay that long.
oh,
I don't want to get the days, the years wrong. Not that it, anyway, I stayed at Ortale Kelley for a number of years, and the clerk and master position in Chancery Court became available when Chris Norris left her tenure a little bit early.
this is another friend of yours who is a lawyer.
Yes, Chris Norris and her husband practiced together. Norris and Norris, a really good firm.
And she left and the position came open. And at that time, you said that Chancellor Kilcrease, Chancellor Brandt, and Chancellor C. Allen Hyde were the three
There were the
chancellors.
three. I called them the three wise men.
And how did you apply for that position and get it?
I really don't know how I got it, but I did have to interview with all three. And I had tried a bunch of cases in front of Chancellor Kilcrease. So he did know me. And Bob Brandt, I knew socially. And but Bob Brandt, knew all of the applicants. So that didn't necessarily give me a leg up. So, however, I was lucky enough to get the job and so happy to get to work for those three men. It was a lot of fun.
What were you told about your responsibilities and the supervision that you would be given?
There really wasn't going to be much supervision. It was up to me to run the office and to keep my staff working as they needed to.
And did you establish any type of schedule or work habits that apply to that position?
Well, I had 22 staff members, 22 employees, and so I usually got to work before they did and left after they did. I really tried to do that because I thought it's the least I could do. And I also wanted them to come to work timely and to just, they didn't have to stay as late as I did. They shouldn't have, and usually didn't. But late meant leaving like at 5:30.
Right.
And that's not late for somebody in private practice. But the staff would be gone by 4:30. So it wasn't hard to stay late. Sometimes it was hard to get there before they did. But basically I was kind of on my own in a good way. It was a good thing. I had people I could go to if I had a problem. And I could go to any of the three and did if it had something to do with their case.
What was the job of being the clerk and master like?
The job, I'm going to say, had really two big components. One was to make sure that the processes, that the rules of civil procedure required were followed, like the filing of the complaint, to make sure that the staff knew that they're supposed to file anything anybody brought them, even if they thought they shouldn't file it and let the chips fall as they were going to. If it was their duty to file it. And so that's an example of making sure that the staff complied with the rules, making sure, I always tried to make sure that they understood why. Because if you understand why something is a rule, you're going to be likely to follow it. You know, if you don't, you might forget, or you might not really want to. So, but I had a really, really good staff, and during my sojourn, and also the other half of the job was hearing cases, lots of accountings. So I really had it brought up on my man. Lots of partitions, which the lawyers know. A partition lawsuit is filed when more than one person owns a piece of real property, and one of the owners does not want to stay in the ownership picture, and so that person can force a sale of the property. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's it basically. And so I had accountings, I had partitions, and then at that time, I was allowed by the three gentlemen to serve as a special chancellor. And so I got to hear a number of workers' compensation cases. I heard motions when the judges were absent, needed to be absent. And it gave me a great bird's eye view of what the chancellors did. Really great. Now that's not doable anymore because the Supreme Court came up with rules to prohibit a person who's not elected from trying cases. And I get that. But at the time, it was much more free range.
And I think you also said that one of the things that happened is, as the clerk and master, lawyers would call you occasionally at home with the TRO, and you would either meet with them or get it filed, and then
we would call the judge that fell in, whoever got the case.
Did you take the paperwork to the judge?
I'm trying to think how we did that. I would file it, and then the judge might come to my home if he wanted to. Was he then? And my receiving those papers was much more complicated when I became chancellor. But at the time, I was the person holding the papers who made sure the right papers got to the right person. And so it really wasn't very, I might take the papers to the chancellor's home if they wanted me to. I did that a couple of times for Chancellor Gilcrease. Occasionally they'd want to come downtown. Sometimes they were already there, working late. So it'd be easy to find. But as time went on, the emergency relief became much more frequent. And as a result of the frequency, the chancellors came up with better ways of dealing with late filings, more uniform, controlled ways.
Today, the clerks in the clerk and master's office are more restricted in the contact that the clerks actually have with the lawyers or people who come to file papers. But you had mentioned some of the staff, and can you give an idea of what it was like with the staff that you had, whether it was Doris or Fran or Julie, what it was like?
Well,
You said you had 22
I had
employees?
22.
Okay.
At some point, maybe I had 19, but somewhere around 22. Doris Willis and Fran Roach were our ambassadors. They were the face of the office, and sometimes Julie Spencer. And everybody loved them, and they had lots of funny stories about lawyers telling them, "Look at my new suit," and they rent the lawsuit, not their clothes. Anyway, they were really good ambassadors and great dispositions for that kind of of encounters with the public. I'd always said, before I became clerk and master, I always thought to myself, I am not gonna have a grumpy person in my office. I'm just not gonna have a grumpy person. Because a grumpy person in the clerk's office can ruin the lawyer's day, by making them feel really little or making things difficult. And we didn't have anybody like that. In fact, Doris Willis in particular would pay attention to what got filed. And then if somebody asked her for advice, she would say something like, I think I remember a case that was kind of like this one that was filed last year. You might want to look at such and such case. That way she could help somebody without doing something without practicing law, but she did know a lot of law. That office, that job was a yes job. It was very rare that you would need to tell somebody no, because if somebody wanted a change in an order or something like that, of course I couldn't change any orders, but they could file a motion with the court. And anything else they wanted, I could probably do for them. And I did try to, but it was a good job because it was a yes job. It's a very helpful job.
How did it change while you were there in that office? Just the nature of the work or the environment? Did you observe any changes in the practice of law, the lawyers?
We had a lot of changes while I was in Chancery, and I'm really grateful for all that I saw.
How long were you the clerk and minister?
About 12 years.
What were the changes?
Well, mediation came into practice, and as a clerk and master, they needed people to do mediations, and so I got to be in the rotation with all the judges who were doing the mediations. So I became a Rule 31 mediator and got the same training that the judges got and started doing mediations. And what I saw was that the more you do, the more you settle. The more practice you have, the more relaxed you are, the more open you are, the more helpful you can be, and cases just start settling. Now, the first day, we've rotated. So the first day I would notice, oh, nothing settled. Day 2, they settled. Day 3, more settled. But, it was I really got the picture, but it's something that people need to do every day. That's what I had to conclude. All right. So there was mediation. There was automation. For the first time, the clerk and master's office was using computers and not as a log, as a way to log cases in, motions, orders, any other papers that were filed. Instead of writing it in the minute book, which we did for so many generations, we were logging them into the computer.
Yes. For those who are watching this, what is a minute book?
A minute book is a book full of paper, like a ledger book. They're big like the ledger books. They're like maybe 1.5 feet, maybe they're 2 feet tall. And they're divided into sections, and they're like a ledger book. So you'd have A through Z, and the plaintiff's name that started with an A would be in the A's. And so that's one way the cases were indexed. There may have been
So
other ways
cases
too over
would
time.
be recorded in these ledger books alphabetically by plaintiff or defendant?
By plaintiff. And by date. So, and the person who was taking the log would describe what it was that was
The nature of the lawsuit.
the nature of the lawsuit, but also the nature of whatever it is that was being filed, like a motion. It was a motion for whatever the caption of the motion would be there in the minute book. So, it wasn't any kind of bad process. It was very cumbersome, and you had to store all those books, and they weren't always so easy to find cases in. You could find them, but they weren't perfect.
Where are those minute books now?
I would think that they would all be with the Metro Archives. There may be some that are with the state archives, but the state may also have Supreme Court and appellate documents that are the old books that they used to have.
And would the files of those cases also be in the archives?
Parts of the files would be, the papers that were required were labeled by the state legislature as permanent
Motions and pleadings.
in orders.
And orders.
Pleadings, motions, orders.
But no memos,
No. They were not permanent.
which really sometimes are the guts of a case, because that's where they explain everything.
That's right.
Well, while you were practicing in these firms and also while you were in Clerk and Master, what participation did you have in the local bar or the state bar?
Well, I think I said earlier that I was so privileged to be with this surge of women who came to law school. I mean, there weren't very many people. There weren't very many women in the law school, Carol, when you and I were there. There were 12 spread out across the 3 years. But just a few years after that, along comes a later Trogger's class, Susan McGannon, Patsy Cottrell. No, Patsy was at UT. Patsy at the University of Tennessee, but along came a big surge of women such that maybe a third of the class was women. And that, the fact that there were so many just kind of burst open some other opportunities. The numbers made a big difference because in those numbers are going to be people who are going to be beaten down the door wherever they wanted to work. Judge Daughtry was not able to find a job in a private firm, although she wanted to have that opportunity. But with the surge that came after Sissy's group and after your group that you and I were in, women had a great opportunity. Most of the women that I knew had taught for maybe a year or two, or maybe even 5 before they went to law school, because teaching was an honorable profession. It was one that women were expected to go into. And most of the women who came to law school and went to medical school and did all these things that we couldn't do before wanted to have a bigger life than their mothers had had. Their mothers were a big influence on them. Some of the mothers, including mine, to encourage me to have a career besides homemaking. So she thought I'd be happier that way. I think she was right. But if I had been born 5 years before, 10 years before, I don't know what I would be doing right now, but I would not be a lawyer. I just don't think that would have been a possibility. So, so I want to say that. And you were asking me
About participation in
bar activities.
bar activities and law-related activities like law.
Yeah. Well, the most time-consuming and rewarding activity that I was involved in was that this surge of women that I mentioned followed Judge Sissy Daughtry's leadership in establishing a women's bar association and for lawyers in Nashville. And it came to be all across the state.
Lawyers.
But women lawyers, this was to enhance and benefit women lawyers. And it was called Lawyers Association for Women. And we had men as members too. But the purpose was to benefit women lawyers. And I was privileged to be its first president. And as a result of LAW, I
Now,
made
what
so
year
many.
do you think this happened?
Should have been 81, 81 or 82. But because I was dedicated to LAW and had such a wonderful experience, I really wasn't that involved in the National Bar Association. And some people were. It just so happened that I focused on LAW to my great benefit. Made wonderful friends, and we did some exciting and amazing things.
But you were a member of the Nashville Bar
Yes,
Association.
and the Tennessee Bar Association.
Did you become involved in any way with their committees?
Well, I was in the Chancery and Circuit Court committee, and the goal of that committee was to make things better for practitioners and to educate the judges. So we just there's a lot of back and forth. It was good.
Did you serve on the board at all? directly?
I was on the board for, I think, 2 years.
I think you also said, once you became a chancellor, you were on the memorial committee, which is a very important committee of the National Bar that memorializes lawyers that have
That's
passed.
a very meaningful.
What other activities
Opportunity.
did you have outside of the law while you were practicing?
Well, I was active in my church, Belmont United Methodist Church. And, I'm a member of the covenant class there, wonderful people at that church who don't talk a lot about making the world a better place. They just go do it. I really like seeing that.
I think you had some participation with Bill Barnes.
Bill Barnes was the pastor at Edgell United Methodist Church, where Gordon and I and our child attended for 30 years. Well, we did it. And he was a real pastor and leader, helped people think through things, and
He was really devoted to housing those who didn't have.
that's why that fund was set up in his name.
With Bill Barnes.
He was devoted to people who'd never had a chance.
And what is the Bill Barnes Fund?
Well, I know that the Bill Barnes Fund is there to provide affordable housing. And some of that money gets released every year. And some of that money went to make possible the Randy Rogers housing, which is on Rosa Parks. It is, I don't know how many units are there, but it's a mixed income place for people to live. And the rents are not market rents. They're much more affordable than market rents. And it looks, because the building is fairly near where I live now in Germantown, it looks very successful. I wish I knew, I need to find out some more about it, but it looks like a really good place.
How long, I think you said that you were the clerk and master 12 years or so.
Mhm.
And what led to a change in your status from clerk and master to your next position?
Well, I had earlier applied to be chancellor. And one reason that I applied, I did want to be a chancellor. I wanted to do it the easy way, not the hard way. But I also felt like in order to express my respect for the judges for whom I worked, I really needed to apply. So I applied even when there was a Republican governor, and I'm not Republican, so I don't think, and I certainly didn't have any high profile. So there wasn't really, I probably wasn't going to be seriously considered by the governor, but because that's how it works. But then, so I applied the first time, and I didn't even make it out of the committee. Neither did a lot of other people who I like a lot. And then I reapplied in 2003, and Phil Bredesen did appoint me. Not only did my name get out, but Phil Bredesen appointed me. So I was beyond thrilled and very grateful to him.
And how was your first day in office?
Well, my first day, I think, was probably a motion day. And that would mean it was very challenging. I just remember being on the bench, and I've said some things to the judges and ruled on some things. And I remember thinking, I would like to take back some of the things I said. No, I didn't say anything bad, but there's just better ways to say it than the way that I said it. I just wanted to take back just about everything. But as time went on, I became more accepting of myself, and I think I improved. I think I listened to other people, and I tried to improve.
One of the comments that you made when I was asking you earlier about the substance of the work from what you did as a clerk master, what it was like as a chancellor, do you recall how it changed?
Well, one thing that was a big change was that it was not a yes job. And that's a little bit painful. I was used to being able to help anybody who came in the door. Well, now I can only help the person who's got the law and the facts on their side. So,
How did you find that transition?
I had been around the chancellors long enough that I knew that it could be done in a gracious way. And I just hoped that I could do it as graciously as the chancellors who were already in place.
So did you have any trouble telling people no?
Yeah, right. But that's the job. I mean, you do get a little hardened to it, but you still have to be sympathetic and empathetic with the people who lose. And Randy Kennedy, Judge Kennedy, who's in probate, was one of the best examples of people who are able to deliver bad news in a way that was still affirming of the person who was litigating in front of him. I saw him do that a lot. I tried to copy him, but there's nobody like Randy Kennedy, except Randy Kennedy. I was going to say that I didn't want to forget to say that besides mediation and automation of the minute books, when I was appointed chancellor, and this was true while I was clerk master, there was a new idea, relatively new idea, which was that the judge has the duty to make sure that the case moves forward and that there's no unnecessary delay, because the public was generally unhappy with the judiciary for the reason that they couldn't get their litigation through in a timely way. Now, that was some people's experience, and I think it was enough of a problem that that the National Center for State Courts and the Judicial College began to adopt case management rules and began training judges in using those case management rules. So that became a really big thing for judges to look after their cases and consider them the judge's responsibility to get them set, get them tried, get them resolved. Whether they were tried, whether they were mediated, but get them resolved. That was on the judge more than the parties. And that took a lot of work, especially since there was nobody to help you. I mean, I don't mean that you didn't have staff to help you, but the lawyers were not really going to help you unless your case management rule was going to benefit their case. And sometimes it would, and sometimes it wouldn't. So
explain a little bit about the judicial college. Did you ever go there?
I did.
And what was the purpose and benefit of the judicial college?
All judges in Tennessee, while I think this is still the case, are funded to go to the Judicial College for an introduction to being a part of the judiciary.
In Reno?
In Reno, Nevada. It's connected to the University of Nevada. It's separate but connected. And I went to that 3 weeks and I got a lot out of it. They teach the judges basic rules of evidence and some very sophisticated rules of evidence, and also introduce judges to what being a judge is about, what being a part of the judiciary is about. And I mean, that's really a great thing. My favorite course, the best course I had, Judicial College, I have told a number of people about because I think it would benefit just about any judge, was one on writing opinions. Because that class provides judges with a template. If you take the class and you like the class and you want to use the class attributes, then you are adopting a template that you can use to write your opinion.
Well, maybe the way of things and
Yep.
structure.
The profound item on that template is the issues of the case. If you can figure out, with the help of the lawyers, what the issues on the case are, then if you can figure out what those issues are, they're profoundly orienting, is what I would say. You're now oriented to a body of law, you're oriented to whether the statutes will apply to this particular issue. So once you figure out what the issues are, which is really not easy,
Right.
then,
How to describe the issues accurately, and I think you said kind of customizing it for that case.
for that case, definitely, there's nothing wrote about the template except for the subject matter that you're going to be addressing. And it's all, each case would have totally different findings and rulings. But that helped me more than anything because you can take that template and dictate your opinion, which I came to believe was the best way to resolve a case because you can move the case along and you do not have to take it under advisement. Taking a case under advisement is damaging to the judge because the judge is not going to be able to remember everything. Plus, that case under advisement sits on your shoulder until it's done. And you might have, if you got 2 or 3, you got 14, you're not even sleeping very well at night. So, it's
how
really
did you-
important to get
how
them
did
done.
you handle dictating decisions?
Well, we had, by the time I left, we were able to dictate and send the audio information, audio file through email to the lawyers. And then the lawyers would either get a court reporter or somehow create the order without a court reporter and transcribe the decision. So, but when I first started dictating, I either dictated to my secretary if the parties had no money, or I would ask the parties to have a court reporter there so I could dictate the decision.
What were some of the memorable cases or cases that you had that you liked?
Well, the high profile cases I had my first year were, I wouldn't say I liked them because they were so challenging, but one of them was English only, which looked at whether the plaintiff who wanted to make sure that only English was used in Metro Nashville for
Governmental
everything,
documents.
for governmental everything. And that involved looking at the referendum that was proposed to be sent to everyone and whether it complied with the law. And in the case that I had, it did not. So I had a lot of education of myself that I had to accomplish before understanding what those issues were. Another high profile case I had was guns and bars. Our legislature was beginning to, or was continuing its admiration of the Second Amendment by making it possible for people to have guns in bars, but the issue became, what is the place where you could, because you could take a gun in a restaurant, in a bar that served a certain amount of food. You could not take your gun in a bar that did not serve enough food and did not have enough food inventory or income to qualify. So the question became, well, then how would anybody know whether they could carry a gun into a restaurant without looking at their books? So, so that was pretty interesting too. I had capital punishment cases that examined whether the execution protocol was cruel and unusual punishment. And those cases, I think I had 3 of them, and I found them to be exceedingly sad and depressing. And one reason I felt that way, besides the obvious that you're making a decision that cannot be undone. And I was not the judge who put down an order after execution, but I was the judge that had to comment and examine protocol for execution to see whether that method of killing the person was acceptable or not. So when I had those cases, they were all consuming because the Supreme Court wanted them done in a certain period of time, which is a short period of time. They were all consuming, and you're just sort of drowning in sad, tragic stuff. Now, one thing I noticed about all my cases that had to do with inmates, and Chancery had for many years had lots of cases that dealt with inmates, and then those diminished somewhat, but I would be called on to read the whole file, and part of the file about that inmate was what their situation was, who had raised them, who was their next of kin. And there was never an inmate's file in which there were two parents who were both okay. There was usually one parent who was not okay, and the other parent was missing. And so they really didn't have anybody to guide them, and their lives were a disaster, consequently. And some of them were even executed. So that's something all of them had in common. I realized that I missed the opportunity to say something about our second sabbatical, which is when I was a clerk and master.
I wanted to ask you about that.
And because you couldn't have a sabbatical as a judge, as far as I knew. If I could have, I would have. But I did. The three wise men did let me take a few months off, and my spouse and I and our son went to Hungary to work on a human rights organization. 1994. And you remember, communism had basically fallen in 1989 and later. So we were arriving in a country in which there was great cynicism. The Communist Party, the communist government, had infiltrated and controlled the churches. The communist government had made sure that there were no watchdogs. So there were no nonprofit entities. So civil society was a wreck. And we arrived at a time when English became very a necessity for a lot of the population, because that's what the commercial language was coming to be. So you had people who spoke only Hungarian, which is related to not much except Finnish, and they had to move to English also. And it was really, really hard. Probably not so much so for children, but for the adults who were already had some sort of career, it was really hard on them.
And
So
your mission on this sabbatical was to
the organization that we worked for was for the purpose of examining and making better and protecting the people of color in Hungary. And those included the Africans who had Communist Party had brought over to Hungary to educate them and then send them back to Africa. They were marooned in Hungary because their countries that they came from were at war. So they didn't necessarily, yeah. And there was nobody to send them back, even if they wanted to go back. And sometimes they couldn't go back, because if they went back, they'd be killed. So they were marooned in Hungary, and everybody in Hungary was blonde, strawberry colored hair, fair in the main, but the Roma stood out, and the Africans stood out because there weren't very many of them. And it was okay in that country to discriminate against those people, especially the Roma. We saw the Roma being thrown off of public transportation by other people, citizens just in the subway car, and wouldn't let them on. And on a couple occasions, we said, why are you taking that person off? Because we couldn't see that much difference between that person and the other people who were in the subway car. And by the way, they had a fabulous public transportation in Hungary. So we couldn't see the difference. And somebody explained to them that they're Roma. To us, there's a great difference. You know, we know the Roma immediately. We didn't as Americans. We couldn't see that. But they were greatly mistreated. They were beaten. And our organization was there to somehow help them, over the long term, be integrated into society, if that's what they wanted. And for the ones who could stay and wanted to stay, and for those who didn't want to stay, to help them figure out what they're going to be doing. So it was very worthwhile. Our son decided he had a couple of months he had to go to school to complete the 8th grade. And so he went to the Technical Institute where some classes were taught in English, some were taught in Hungarian, rather than the American school where everything would have been taught in English. But he wanted to do it the hard way. So he got greatly rewarded though for it because he made great friends, and he made friends with one guy who's still his Raymond, who's still his dear friend. Raymond lived in Subotica, which is in Serbia. And if somebody had told me you're going to allow your child to go to Serbia with all the violence that was in that area of the country at one point anyway, I would have said, there's no way. But he was with a family that lived within about 30 miles of, Subotica is about 30 miles from the Hungarian border. The mother of the family was Hungarian. The father was a Serb from Montenegro. And they adopted Houston, and they wanted him there every weekend. Well, we didn't let him go every weekend. And when we went ourselves, we said we want to be adopted too. So one thing I like to remember about Serbia was that everybody, all the families are out at night, just strolling around, and it's the best bread I've ever tasted. The Hungarian bread was not very good, but Hungarian food was good, but the bread specifically, the everyday bread they had was really not very tasty. But we,
Did you see any changes while you were there in the way the Romas or the Africans were treated?
no, I couldn't say that at all.
And did you find out if at any point after you left that conditions did change or get modified in any way?
I think things are a little easier now for people who have had to learn English. Their economy is a little better than, well, we had Orban. Orban was a hero when we were there. Young people wanted Orban in office. And now, of course, he's become a dictator. And young people who were for him, who are now middle-aged, are really, really upset and disappointed with what's happened to the country because of edging, of course, edging big time back into communism. So
How long were you all there?
we were there about 4 months. It's
And
really
then-
not long enough to notice changes.
But then you did return back to the position of clerk and master.
I
and
did.
then
But
we
now
went
we're back
to
in Chancery.
Chancery
Uh-huh.
Court. And one of the things you were talking about were the cases that were so difficult and taxing to you because of the issues involved, that you also had a chicken case.
Oh, I did have an administrative appeal, chicken case. You want to hear about that one?
Well,
could do it in
I
a
think you
nutshell.
could talk a little bit about what there was with regards to administrative appeals, just to kind of give people who do not go to Chancery what that means. And what was the chicken case?
Okay, well, what I learned slowly after becoming associated with Chancery is that so much of our lives are now regulated by agencies, either state agencies or federal agencies, particularly state agencies and city agencies, agencies that govern our lives to some extent in Metro Nashville. So there's a lot of activity that takes place in the agency. If a lawyer only gets involved on appeal, then sometimes there's not much the lawyer can do. I mean, it's always better to have a lawyer than not have one, because at least you have some hope. But if the lawyer is involved in the agency, then the lawyer can bring the case along so that there are things that can be appealed if the lawyer loses. So, an example of an administrative appeal would be, and we did have a number of these cases, would be a licensure situation where a physician, a nurse, a real estate broker, anybody with a license has stepped outside ethical conduct. Real estate is another example. Step outside ethical conduct, and then their agency that licenses them and gives them ethical rules will discipline their license, is what it's called. And that will be done in the agency. The agency will have a hearing, they'll take proof, the decision will be made by a board or by an agency head or by an administrative judge. And then the losing party will come to Chancery to appeal, and the appeal opportunities are pretty slim. But you still have an appeal process and appeal appeal principles that are very meaningful and important. So, so the physician would have a trial in the agency. The physician is being accused of misconduct, would maybe have the license discipline, then that doctor would appeal to Chancery and then have an administrative hearing in Chancery, which just meant addressing the merits of what had happened below. And does it comply with the many rules for agency conduct? Because, you know, you've got a whole chapter or two or three on administrative law in the green books, as Justice Harbison would say. So it would be the chancellor's job to apply the state law to what the agency had done. And, you know, in Chancery, there were a number of reversals. I mean, that was not uncommon. But you wouldn't necessarily think you were going to win just because you're appealing.
So in a sense, as a chancellor, you try cases, but when you have an administrative appeal, you act as an appellate judge.
That's right. That's a perfect
And
way to say it.
you did have the chicken case on appeal.
Well, I know you remember that because it was right before Metro decided that at least some part of Metro Nashville could raise chickens specifically, on their property. At the time, I had the administrative case that involved chickens. There was no place in Metro Nashville where you could have farm animals. And I had to decide that the chickens are farm animals because that's what the state statutes say. If you read all of them, but, a very lovely woman, who lived on Leland Lane, I think she had like a quarter acre in her house. And she had built a chicken coop, which was, you know, a palace for her chickens. She had about 6 chickens, and she insisted her theory was that her chickens were not farm animals, they were pets. And consequently, she could keep them. Well, she made it through the zoning board review of her chickens and whether they were pets or whether they were farm animals. And the zoning board decided that they were pets and therefore they were not farm animals. Well, they decided they were pets because the chickens could definitely do tricks. I mean, they knew they could follow their mistress's voice to come to her and maybe fly up and sit on her knee, or, you know, peck this little bit of corn over here, but, you know, they were tricks. They were pretty impressive. And then I noticed, when I had the hearing, I noticed that Stuart Clifton's wife, Louise, just a great person.
Stuart Clifton is another lawyer.
Stuart Clifton is another lawyer that people will know. He also served as councilman for several
His wife.
terms, and his wife, Louise, who was equally a neat person. So she was in the audience, and I thought, wonder why she's here. So as the proof, as the lower agency's decisions unfolded and we all learned about them, one reason this lady thought the chickens were her pets was because they were not treated as farm animals. For example, Louise Clifton made them scarves that they could wear in the winter. And they did wear the scarves in the winter. And, okay, so they had tricks. They wore clothing because they were pets. They wore clothing.
They were trained.
They were trained. Now, you can't housebreak a chicken. That was part of the proof too, but you can train them in many, many other ways. They really, that's why they need to have their palace, their coop. So the whole picture that she presented sounded, I just wish she'd been in my neighborhood, because she would invite everybody over to have a glass of wine and watch the chickens because they all have a lot of personality. And the whole picture was one that should be able to be continued. I mean, there was no good reason why she couldn't continue to have her chickens except for the law, which is that she was not zoned to have farm animals, and the chickens were, regardless of how much she loved them, they were farm animals. So I had to follow state law and make that decision. And the case was fun, but I didn't like having to do that because I wanted chickens too by the time this thing was over. I don't think anybody could sit through that here and not want chickens. They just, they were just so much fun. But she had wanted, of course, to escape the fact that she had been cited for ordinance violation for having the chickens in her yard. Now, her friends who came over and had wine and watched the chickens, none of those neighbors reported her. But a neighbor did report her who was trying to sell a lot that was right contiguous to hers, didn't have a house on it. And I think he thought the chickens were going to somehow degrade the value of his property. So he did report her, and she did have to go through all the ordinance violation. She was found not guilty of the ordinance violation. It's not criminal, but she was found not to be in violation of the ordinance by the zoning board. But I did have to find that she was in violation at the level Chancery. And I will add just one little piece of information, which was that the zoning board staff, people remember Sonny West and how he really knew his stuff. He found and advised his staff that these were not pets, they were farm animals. And that's really the way the case needed to go. But the zoning board thought differently, and that's their job. So
I think when we spoke about some of the things that happened at work, how it played into your home life. And I heard you say that the impact on your family was addressed by both Gordon and Houston. Do you recall?
I think it worked. Oh, I do recall, because I've been retired for 2.5 years, and I still feel like I'm kind of in transition from being a judge. But my family pretty early on advised me that when they took a position about something, especially if it involved emotion, that it was not helpful for me to point out the things on the other side of their position. And it was not helpful for me to comment on newspaper articles that I wish we had more information, because we don't really know if such and such happened or this and such happened. And we don't really have the other person's side. So all they've done is interview this one person. But this is not a good conversation, Gambit. It caused some disgruntled feelings in my household. And I really, when both Gordon and our son Houston said this is obnoxious, I really thought it's obnoxious. So I really tried to be more aware of how people feel about the positions that they take and why they think this is true and should be promoted, and this is not true and should not be promoted. So I wish I could give you some examples, but I probably shouldn't.
I don't think that you did, but you did mention that your comment on the one hand
And on the other hand, it's not welcome.
not well, at the home front.
Uh-huh.
As you reflect back your career in law, what would you say were some of the rewards and advantages?
Well, the advantage that I had from the day I was born was that I was born in 1948 and not in 1930 or even 40, because I have had tremendous opportunity, which I took advantage of. And I have had a rich career as a lawyer. And it could be a close thing, because maybe I wouldn't have made it into that surge of women. And if I hadn't, I'd be doing something else, but I can't imagine liking anything better than I like the practice of law. So I feel tremendously privileged and lucky. I feel so lucky that I had Sissy Daughtry in my life, that I had Carol McCoy in my life, that I had numerous other women who all had the same goal, which is to make the world a better place. And I think and Gordon, oh my gosh. Yeah, Gordon is a person who
Tell me about
likes women. He likes women as people. He doesn't seem to understand that women can sometimes be placed in second tier situations because he would never do that. He would never do that. And, so I think I told you, well, what I would add about Gordon is that he is a religious soul, even though he's not, maybe he was raised Catholic, he's no longer Catholic, but he is a religious soul and he's helped me so much in that way. And, he's a noble person. He's very noble.
I think you said it was the best when you met him that you knew at that point he was the best person. We had time to find that, a little note on that, because it was from the heart.
So my father rarely praised us because he was really a reserved person. And I think he felt like when he praised us, he was praising himself, which is kind of true. But we didn't get much comment on our character or our personalities or our good deeds. But one day he said to me, "You have good judgment." I never forgot it because it was such a compliment from him. And I exercised good judgment when I met Gordon. You know, I just kind of made a quick decision, and that was the right one.
The quote that I had is, "He was the best person I ever met." And I think that is very telling of every time you talk about him, that comes through when you think that of your husband. Let me ask you now about the hardships and the pitfalls of having a career in law. What would you say were those points?
Well, Carol, one of the most challenging things about becoming a chancellor and about being clerk and master, because I was called on to talk a lot about various clubs would ask me to come and talk about what Chancery is, what did I do as clerk and master, et cetera. I had to overcome stage fright as a young lawyer. And sometimes, you know, you could get used to public speaking and then you wouldn't do it for a while. You come back to it and it was really hard to get up to speed again. Once I became a chancellor and I was talking all day, hopefully not to the exclusion of other people talking too, but you did have to rule on all the time, and you had to rule on the spur of the moment about evidentiary questions. You no longer have a fear of public speaking because it becomes ordinary. And that was a big plus about being a chancellor.
I think when I posed that to you, one of the things that you mentioned from the get-go about being a lawyer is having to make a living. And paying the staff, paying the rent. One of the hardships that you recall was the dissolution of the law firm. If I'm
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And then you also mentioned about clients that didn't pay their bill. I think every lawyer can relate to that. So what are the current activities that you participate in?
I'm active in my church, Belmont United Methodist. I'm on the board of Healing Arts
And what does that
Project
do?
Inc. That organization provides art lessons. And these are visual art lessons to people who are struggling with mental illness. So, for instance, at Centerstone, or a place like Centerstone, where people come to see a therapist or to get medication. Art classes are offered there. We pay the teacher. We have maybe 10 teachers to come in and teach for a couple of hours. and then teach again a couple of hours, and then take the product of the people who are willing to have their work displayed. Their exhibits, there's an exhibit on the fourth floor of Chancery, or on the fourth floor of the historic courthouse, there's an exhibit of Healing Arts Project Inc. And that's a review of the art pieces that have been crafted in, say, the last year. And the artist's name is there, a description of the description that the artist, by artist, I mean student artist, a description of the student artist that the artist would like to have out there for in the public. And a comment about why they painted a particular scene or person or figure that they painted. And there's also an exhibit in the criminal court. There's an exhibit in the public library. I think it's a downtown library. And a number of other public places where we know there are a lot of people who come. The one in the criminal court is in the jury room. So everybody comes there.
You had a lot to do with that.
I did, and it's very satisfying. Now, the criminal court exhibit didn't start until, I think, January of this past year, January 2022, because of COVID. And it just became difficult to get access to anything. And there's no people there anyway, but they're back.
What other activities do you just?
Well, I have a collection, a wonderful group of women who do various things together. It's not a club, but it is a group of people who walk together either in the morning or the afternoon of every day. Every day there is a walk, and every day the walk's going to be about 4 miles. So it keeps everybody up and going, and it promotes friendship because we're all talking while we're walking. So that's a lot of fun. That's just fun. I've spent the last year downsizing and moving out of our home in Belmont Hillsborough, our house in Belmont Hillsborough, which, by the way, was near Bill Ramsey, another fabulous lawyer in Nashville with Neil and Harwell. So we left that neighborhood. Well, Miss Bill, we left that neighborhood. We're now in Germantown. And so that has taken up a lot of my time, but it's also very worthwhile because we love Germantown. We love our new neighbors. It was a very good move.
Your book clubs?
I'm in 2 book clubs. So there's a lot of fun reading to enjoy. Gordon and I left a neighborhood where Vanderbilt University, and Lipscomb, kind of like a triangle. So there's always something going on at any of those or all of those universities. So we're now in a neighborhood that has Fisk University and Tennessee State University. And there's a lot going on there too. We're more aware of Fisk because it's truly, just a half a mile from us. We can walk over there. So we're more aware of Fisk, but we've moved to a different set of universities, and and Mary's there. So we want to find out more about what volunteer opportunities there are. Haven't done it yet, but that's my next goal.
And that was my next question. What are the projects that you would like to accomplish in the next few years?
Well, I would like to learn more about writing that's not technical writing. And also, as I just said, I would like to know more about what I can do. Gordon is still working full time. I'd like to know what I can do that would be a good volunteer service.
And as a final question, what would you tell a young person about the profession of lawyers and life in the legal system? What encouragement and real practical advice would you give?
I may not be the best person to be giving that advice for this reason. I have, as I said before, I think I've said it 5 times, I've been so privileged to be a lawyer. I realize I could easily have missed the boat. And I have so benefited from the legal education from all the opportunities that I have had, which have been many. So when people ask me, do you think I should go to law school? Then I say, yes, you should definitely go to law school. But I temper that with, is there any way that you can go to law school somewhere without borrowing money? Or, keeping a very tight lid on the amount that you borrow, because I think given that tuitions are so high everywhere, I mean, you need to do a lot of research to find out where is there a good law school that has a semi-affordable tuition. To me, it's the financial stuff. That's the real problem now. And, but should I go get a law degree? If you could do that without hurting yourself, your future in terms of financial stability, I would just always say yes. So I've loved it.
Claudia, thank you. And this terminates our interview. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you, Carol.